First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in the beautiful city of Poznań and at this highly interesting institute with its highly interesting study programs. And it's really a pleasure for me to present our project here. The first thing I want to say about the project is it's called Society After Money, a simulation, and it's the second part of the project. The first part was called Society After Money, a dialogue. And it's funded, of all things, by the Volkswagen Foundation. And you might be surprised to hear that for several reasons. And I want you to tell that the Volkswagen Foundation has nothing to do nowadays with Volkswagen. They're completely independent, but their starting capital was given to them by Volkswagen after the war for the obvious reason that Volkswagen was implicated in the crimes of the Nazi regime. And so in the Republic of Germany after the war, so to speak, the deal was you give $1 billion capital for a public foundation that will fund projects in arts, sciences, and culture. So to speak, to make a little bit of your guilt better. And that's why the Volkswagen Foundation is nowadays, after the German Research Foundation, the second biggest funding institution in Germany for, let's say, humanities and cultural studies. And I have to say, they are quite unbureaucratic, and it's always a pleasure to cooperate with them. So that you understand the background. Then, before I really start, Society After Money. This sounds really weird. I have to admit that. And the reason why we have chosen this title was a little bit, the Volkswagen Foundation in 2015 launched a program which had the title Originalitätsverdacht. It's not easy to translate into English. It's basically suspected originality. And the idea was to fund projects which are more or less experimental, interdisciplinary, and asking for questions that seem perhaps outlandish at first. So we had the idea, based on some earlier research we've done, to make a project that tries again to tackle in interdisciplinary research the possibilities of forms of economic organization which are not based on the general equivalent of money, or at least not in the first place, based on money or perhaps on other forms of money. This is something we very controversially discussed, and I have to say, looking backwards, it was the most interesting project I ever made, although I don't think we have a univocal result, and to be honest, it robbed me some of my illusions. What other forms of organizations can be, because it turned out to be a really, really complicated problem. Perhaps one could have suspected this right from the beginning, but we tried to find out by ourselves. Okay, why of all things Society After Money? Well, the basic idea was we have problems. This cannot be overlooked. One of the biggest problems to come with us is climate change. And climate change, one of the reasons of climate change is, of course, that we have a growth imperative in our economies. There are many discussions about that in the present, for like the degrowth discussion. Can we really grow and grow and grow? Because we are on a finite planet. As Luhmann once said, the Earth is finite because it's round. And so can we grow? And where is the link to money? Well, money is abstract, and it makes no difference if you have 1 million. Okay, for you personally, it makes a difference, but you can have 1 million, you have 1 billion, you can have 10 billion, you have 100 billion. It can grow indefinitely, in principle. And when it grows, it can grow indefinitely on a finite planet. Isn't that the problem? So this is a very shortened explanation for why the idea was, can we think about economic organization that is not based on the accumulation of an abstract medium that, because of being abstract, can grow indefinitely. So this is to put it in a nutshell. So my presentation will start with a general overview over the project, who are the members, what we did in the past. Then, in the second part, I will go into, let's say, a snippet, a small part of our theoretical discussion, which turned out to be highly controversial. Sometimes in the project it got loud. It got really loud, and we really fought our fights about really complicated theoretical problems that I learned to understand on the way of the project. It was highly interesting to discuss with economists, sociologists, and so on. And we even built friendships of that during this project. It was really interesting. I will go into one theoretical special problem in the second part. And in the third part, the last part, I will give you also a very short and fragmented insight into the simulation we are doing in the second part of our project. As I said, the project had two phases. The first was theoretical, we discussed theoretical problems. In the second part, we tried to build an agent-based simulation model based on some of the ideas developed in the first phase. This is not as unusual as it might sound, because computer simulation is a much used tool in economics and in sociology, and especially the currents of heterodox economics, which do not conform to the, let's say, I mean this is really shortened, the so-called neoclassical standard model, often use agent-based modeling. And we tried what will happen if we try to take some of our theoretical insights and put them into a model and let it develop. What turns out? Well, there is no blueprint coming out at the end for something that might help us for the future, but it helped us see more clearly what the problems and open questions are. Because it's one thing to think about economical and political organization. The other thing is, when you try to put it in a model, you have to get very concrete and very specified. And then you find out what you haven't thought of before. And then you begin going back to theory, and you go back to the model, and you go back to theory, and everything gets ever more complicated. But in a way, this is to spoil a little bit the end. The increase in complexity of the problem is one of the most important results of the project, although this might sound a little bit depressing, but I guess this is what science is all about. Okay, I will show you the general lineup of the project right now. These are the PIs from 5 different universities. We have Professor Gabriele Gramelsberger from the RWTH Aachen, and she's a theory of science and philosophy of technology, and she's especially a specialist in the theory and history of computer simulation. And that's why she was very important for our project. Then we have Stefan Meretz from the Commons Institute in Bonn. You will hear in a minute why commons theory is very important for our project, and he's one of the leading theorists in that field in Germany. Then there is myself in media studies. You will wonder why of all things media studies is implicated in that project. I will tell you. Then we have Hanno Pahl, who is now in Bonn too. At that time he was at the LMU in Munich. He's a sociologist, and especially he's a sociologist and historian of economics. He wrote two very interesting books on the history. The first is about Marx and Luhmann and the relation between Marx and Luhmann on the role of money. And the second book, already he has a third book right now, and the second book he wrote was a kind of the history of neoclassical economics. And so he's a very specialist in the history of economics and economic theory. And finally, our economist from Vienna, from the University of Economics in Vienna, Manuel Scholz-Weckerle. He's a specialist in evolutionary political economics and economical theory, and they did lots of agent-based simulations in Vienna long before the project. So he's also an expert in doing such simulations. And this was I think, a very interesting lineup of people, and we have very interesting discussions, as I said. Oh, this is, of course, very boring to have a slide full of text, but this is, so to speak, the abstract of our project. The question was, are post or non-monetary economies not just theoretical conceivable? You could even debate this part. But is it possible to simulate them? We not only ask if digital media may provide an infrastructure for other economies, but use tools of simulation to explore this. The second point here on the slide is very important for our theoretical design. We draw heavily on the work of Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom was the first woman to get the Nobel Prize. Actually, it's the Bank of Sweden Prize, but it's called the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009 as the first woman ever for her groundbreaking book, Governing the Commons. I will tell you about that later. And this is very important as a theoretical source for us. Third point, I mentioned this already. Although agent-based simulation is a widespread tool of economic research, these simulations usually always, without question, assume monetary and market economies. So why not experimentally use them for something else? This was the idea. Yes, this was the goal, so to speak. We develop a simulation model of a non-monetary and non-market economy and document and reflect on this construction process. I will tell you about that too. That's, so to speak, only the abstract. And this, as I already said, in the light of the current discussion on economic and ecological crisis, the attempt to simulate other economies is of highest societal relevance. That is what you always write in such applications for funding institutions, of course. This is, to cut a long story short, this is the result of our first phase. Society After Money, a dialogue. This is the German book on the left side, Postmonetary Denken, Thinking Post-Monetary. And on the right side is the English translation. It's basically the same book. The English book is a little bit revised and has an additional afterword by Anitra Nelson. And it appeared with Bloomsbury in 2019, I guess. So this was the result. And to give you just a very little look into what we've done in the first phase. For example, we try to map what initiatives and theoretical approaches are there that think about such organizational forms. I don't go through them now in detail. It would take too long. But these are, so to speak, there's the approach. How is the division of labor thought of? How is the relation to technology? How are the organizational principles thought in these models? Just to get an overview over this field. And if you're interested in that in detail, in the book I showed you a minute ago, there is a very long essay by Lars Heidmann, which gives a very detailed overview over this discussion historically. There she is, the grand old lady of commons theory, Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize, and she's, as I said, one of the central theoretical source for our project. But there are two additional guys which might be interesting, which are interesting or it's central for our discussion. The guy on the left side, you all know too well. And of course, I don't have to tell you this in Poland, although all historical experiments that themselves argue to be based on Marx ended up in a horrible disaster. It cannot be said otherwise. The theoretical discussions which were ignited by the work of Marx, are still interesting today. The question, what is the value form? What is the division of labor? What is the role of technology? And so on. This is still something which is interesting because there is a wide flourishing post- and anti-Stalinist discussion in Marx. Has been in the West, has been in the East, oppositional currents, and of course there are new forms that combine Marx with post-structuralism and so on. On the right side, and you might find this a really weird combination, is arch-liberal, a Nobel Prize winner from 1974, Friedrich August von Hayek. Hayek was one of the strongest defender of market economy, and as I see it, with the best arguments. With the best arguments there are, and very important arguments you cannot ignore. If you think about, is it possible to organize perhaps without money, what also can mean without exchange, because exchange without money is very cumbersome, so an economy without money would perhaps be one without exchange, and so on. You cannot avoid the arguments of Hayek. They are very strong, and I will tell you in a minute why they are so important. And interesting enough, Elinor Ostrom is in a way related to the Austrian school, to which Hayek belongs, but nevertheless, she argued that there are several cases historically in which common collective management of resources beyond markets and beyond states has worked. For showing this historically and theoretically, she won the Nobel Prize. So this is our, so to speak, our theoretical, let's say our theoretical heroes, which gave impulses to the theoretical design of the project. The commons, we had long discussions in the first phase of the project, and it turned out that taking recourse to the theory of the commons is the perhaps most promising way of thinking about economical organizations without money. There are other ways, but it turned out that this is the most promising. And the idea is that you have a coordination, I will tell you about that in a minute, via communicative processes that have a political, institutional, as well as a media technological dimension. That is why the famous book of Ostrom has as its subtitles on the evolution of institutions for collective management of resources. This is about the institutional forms which this takes, and this is very interesting for us. These are details about the question how our simulation model is built up. I don't want to go into detail here. And the question basically is, do the various techno-institutional mechanisms allow communication without money and markets? Which dynamics within the model occur? And this was basically the project architecture. We had on the, from your side, on left top is the Commons group, which was led, of course, by Stefan Meretz, who is the expert. They got into commons theory and tried to translate commons theory into the parameters of the model. On the right side was the simulation group in Vienna, who built the simulation model. And of course, since they were the economists, they always had lots of quarrels with the commons group. And I was in the comfortable position to belong to the reflection group. And the reflection group was me, Hanno Pahl, and Gabriele Gramelsberger. We observed them quarreling, which made a lot of fun. And of course, we quarreled with them too. And this was the idea that we not only have this model construction process, but that we observe this process ourselves and document it and find out what it means to put such theoretical models into simulation models, because this is interesting in itself. How difficult it is, how good or how bad it works. So, and this was basically the line up, the structure of the project. Okay, now I come to the to a little part of the theoretical discussion. Why of all these three people? When you begin to think about the possibilities of other economies, you cannot avoid the so-called socialist calculation debate. This is a very, some people say it's the most important theoretical debate in theoretical economics ever. It started in the 1920s. This way. It started in the 1920s, and the history is complicated. It had to do with war communism and revolutionary Russia, and then the experiments in later the experiments, problematic experiments. And the basic debate was about the question at that time, if a socialist economy, which was at that time understood as steering the economy top-down by centralized planning, and later by so-called market socialist models, but I won't go into that detail right now, are possible or not? Could they work or not? And Hayek was a pupil by Ludwig von Mises. And Ludwig von Mises, first of all, attacked Otto von Neurath and argued in a famous paper that a planned economy is by principle impossible. It's by principle impossible. And for the reason, this is a really big debate and it's really interesting, but to cut it down, the argument was that central planning, even if it worked with money and price signals, would not have or be able to process the information necessary for the economy to run, especially with respect to the production of the means of production itself. One cannot know what should be produced, how, by whom, when, and in what way, with what raw materials, in what quantity. And this was seen as a heavy blow against the theory of central planning at that time. You mustn't forget that this was in the 20s. It wasn't quite sure at that time, as we know today, that central planned economies would ruin themselves as they did. This was unknown at that time. It's a purely theoretical argument. It cannot work because the central planning board, so to speak, this is fictitious instance that plans the economy. First of all, the economy is too complex. You don't have the math and you cannot compute it. This was Mises' argument, basically. Later then came people, well, we have supercomputers, perhaps we can do it. This discussion is still waging today. It still exists. But Hayek radicalized the argument. And this is really, really interesting. He said, no, the problem is not alone that given you have the information, cannot compute it because it's too complex, you don't even get the information. Because economy is a distributed process. It is stretched out over the whole of society, and the people, it's situated knowledge. It's situated in a place, and the people in a given place know best what they need now and what has to be done, and there is no way to collect this information because it's implicit. It's situated, it's tacit, and it's implicit. And this argument, of course, this was also fought and discussed. This argument is basically a very strong argument against the idea of planned economies, because Hayek argued the market, and that's where media studies come in. He argued the market is an information processing machine. The market is it's a kind of computer. It's a kind of computer that cares for the distribution of information and is the optimal mechanism to distribute that information, what is needed, where and when. And the price signals given by money are the basic form of the information that is needed. The discussion rippled back and forth. The severe crisis of 1929 and in its aftermath, some more regulated economies existed, like the New Deal in the US, the Keynesianism after the war. And at that time, many people thought that Mises and Hayek were not right. Many people thought there is the possibility to plan economies, even if you don't think about a very strict central planning. But then, as you all know, the Eastern Bloc collapsed, the miserable states of the planned economies, the static state-planned economies in the East became possible. Neoliberal policies, Reagan and Thatcher was close to Hayek actually, prevailed. And then the the wheels turned, and nowadays it's seen as very sure that the critique of Mises and Hayek, that a planned economy for several reasons cannot work, is correct. But in the last 20 years, given, for example, the climate crisis, the growing inequality, although the absolute numbers of poor people shrinked, the inequality was growing. This whole discussion came back. Nowadays, there's even the talk of the socialist calculation debate 2.0. There are many people, for example, only 2 years ago, Evgeny Morozov published a paper in New Left Review called Digital Socialism, and it's a very long paper. And what does he do? He also talks about Mises and Hayek, as do many people in the discussion. There's still this discussion going on. It's very wide, and I think it's a very interesting discussion. It's always the question, what about the information in the economy? And for me as a media theorist, what are the media of the information in a given economy? How can it in principle be possible to collect this information and to distribute this information? And there is, just to give a very short introduction in this debate which is raging right now. There's appearing several books every year on this debate. It's still going on. For example, Cockshott and Cottrell. Cockshott is in computer science, Paul Cockshott in the UK. He wrote with Alain Cottrell in 1993, not the best year to do that, a book called Towards a New Socialism, and he argued that might supercomputers not be able to solve the countless equations needed to coordinate a country's economy. Other people asked, can't mobile sensor technology, for example, like this, be used to collect precisely that local information that Hayek has thought to be inaccessible? So, it was asked, isn't a planned economy conceivable after all, combining the efficiency of markets with stabilities and with consideration to so-called externalities, such as ecosystems? Another example, Phillips and Rosworski wrote a book with the funny name, The People's Republic of Walmart, in 2019, and they argued, aren't large corporations not actually functioning as planned economies? Some of them are even bigger than states. I mean, think of Amazon. Hadn't Hayek always stressed, and that's true, he did it, that even market economies have to be described as planned economies, but only that the planning is decentralized. Of course, every one of us plans. We think, how much money do we have? Can we afford to buy a new cell phone? Can we afford to go on vacations? Every company plans, every university plans, everyone is planning. But the coordination between the plans, that's the question about that. And if this is so, why does coordination between these units necessarily have to take place without collusion, but only via abstract price signals? And then, why of all competition? Why not cooperation? There's also a famous paper from 1968 of Hayek about that the market as a discovery procedure. I won't go into that. And it was asked, did Hayek's picture ever correspond to reality, actually? After all, people can talk to each other. It's not necessary to communicate only via price signals. And actually, it's not done. Cockshott, for example, argued there's not only the price signals, there's also the quantity signals. What about that? In his famous book on econophysics. And this debate still is bubbling right now, sometimes with very advanced mathematical models. And this discussion is going on, but there still remain problems. For example, from the anarchist side, there's always the argument, well, even if you could do an informationally sound planned economy, that means the plan has to be done. And what if somebody doesn't want to take his place? There's also basically an argument going back to Hayek too, the road to serfdom, that if you plan something, you have to enforce that the plan is done in one way or the other, or you can skip your plan. So isn't planning necessarily authoritarian? And this is the first part of the theoretical discussion, the so-called socialist calculation debate until today. The second theoretical part is, although there are relations between Ostrom and the Austrian school to which Mises and Hayek belong, has a completely different history. The debate about the commons. To cut a long story short, in 1968, Garrett Hardin wrote a paper, The Tragedy of the Commons, which is a very famous paper today. And he argued that the collective management of resources by a community cannot work. And he used the example of a meadow that is used by a number of farmers with their herds. When they all use the meadow ruthlessly, maximizing their own utility, the meadow is soon destroyed. And he presumed that the farmers, in his theoretical example, will behave as optimizing agents like in classical economical theory. Everyone tries to optimize his own wealth. And if they all go to the meadow and every say, I take the most I can take out, it's just a question of a short time when the meadow is completely destroyed. And this was seen as an argument that collective management cannot work. But it presupposed that the people don't talk to each other, everyone goes on the meadow and optimizes his own utility ruthlessly. But in 2009, Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize for the book published in 1990, Governing the Commons. And in this book, translated in many languages right now, she shows, on the basis of theoretical considerations, historical research, and numerous field studies, that contrary to Hardin's claim, local self-governance of resources can work very well and even be superior to state management or market solutions. And this is a really interesting difference between Ostrom and Harding. Harding deduced purely theoretically that it cannot work, presupposing a model of human behavior taken from classical and neoclassical economics, while Elinor Ostrom looked what is happening empirically. And she found everywhere in the world processes of collective management of resources, the commons, which worked. Partly over hundreds of years, and partly they were not that little. So, the basic argument behind this is, if, according to Ostrom, the various users of the pasture or meadow agree and coordinate, exist as a collective, if you like, establish common rules, and also control their compliance, then the meadow can be used and is used, there are many examples for this, as a common pool resource. Ostrom distilled so-called 8 rules that are necessary. If they are fulfilled and their compliance is checked, then it works. Sorry. And some of them are very long-lasting. You can see this discussion is completely different from the social calculation debate. The socialist calculation debate was talking about whole economies, the big picture, so to speak, centralized planning versus market coordination. The commons people are speaking about local or smaller management, collective management of resources. And in that way, it's more to speak, it's not microeconomics in the strict sense, but it's more on the local level. It's more on a local level. And so you see one question that was emerging in our project quite soon was, I guess you can imagine what it is. The question is, can this process of collective management be scaled up? Does it necessarily only work for local and comparatively small structures? Or can it grow in one way or the other to address, at the end, the field of whatever that means, whole economy? That is basically the fundamental question. And of course, if you begin to think about this, you immediately run into weird problems. As you know, the socialist calculation debate argues, Hayek argues, societies are too complex to be controlled by communicative agreements that would take too long. Let's say we imagine the whole world as one commons. That would mean that every local problem would have discussed by, let's say, 7 billion people. Even if everyone had only 10 seconds to speak on a given problem, this would, I made the calculation, this would amount to 2,220 years of discussion for only one problem. This shows what complexity is. This doesn't work. It's only a caricature, but it makes it clear in a simple way that complexity relates to time and, now to quote Marx, economy of time to this all economy ultimately reduces itself. Economy is not only a question of information, but also of time. And the problem when you have with communicative coordination is that it could take long. By the way, I guess Oscar Wilde is quoted legendary to have said, well, socialism is a wonderful idea, but it takes too many evenings. I don't know if that's true, but it's addressing basically the same problem. So it seems that the idea of separate private production, this is Marx's term for the way market economies are organized, and the later ex post mediation of the results on markets is more convincing and medially more realistic because complexity becomes decentralized and therefore manageable. And this is, to quote it again and again, Hayek's big argument: economics problems would have to be solved by, quote, some form of decentralization, end of quote. That would probably have been the end of the discussion. But, as I said, the question comes up if it's not possible to imagine not having the whole world as a commons, but to organize commons in a different way. How can commons coordination could look like beyond the local resource? As I said, the world economy as one commons cannot work because of its informational complexity, as long as we see that now. Of course, there are, as you can imagine, people that say, well, with artificial intelligence, all this looks different, and, well, we will see. But the other idea is that you have local commons, and then you have a networking process that spins, and this is not so different, actually, from the idea of market economies. You have local entities, but at this time not firms or companies, but commons that then relate through a network process, and the network is growing, so like a fungus, so to speak. It's growing and it's permeating the economy. That's the other approach that is discussed. But you have always to think, what about then the global processes? This is very difficult. I will discuss critically, I have to say, a detailed proposal by Mickiewicz and Stefan Sütterlütti, which are from our Commons guy. And you see, when I discuss this right now, I'm not at all uncritical. And this is very typical for our project because we had all the time these controversies. And I will give you a little bit of this impression of this controversy. There they are again. This is the book by Sütterlütti and Mickiewicz, which appeared with Paul Graf Macmillan recently, where they try to develop a theory of post-capitalism and what they call transvolution based on a commons framework. And this is the book I will now actually criticize. Central planning is, of course, not an option for these authors. And they assume the networking process of commons. One example is the local bread distribution commons. How has want to imagine such a commons? The radical thought, and I personally find that very sympathetic, the radical thought is that it's based on absolutely free decision. This might sound highly utopian, but of course it is. And it wants to be utopian. There's absolutely no force. Nobody is forced to do anything. And the idea is that it's only on the free association of people that, for example, the people who like to bake bread organize themselves into bread production commons. That's the idea. By communication, as was described by Elinor Ostrom. But obviously, the problem immediately emerges. They have to be networked with other commons. For example, the floor people, the sugar people, the energy people, the people that produce ovens, and so on and so on. Otherwise, you can't have bread. Obviously, the whole problems of coordination and informational complexity come back through the back door. And they try to deal with this problem in their book by using three theoretical terms. The first is stigmergy, the second is called neo-planning, and the third is called meta-commons. And this is, you can think what you want about the book. At least it's a try to develop further this approach by Elinor Ostrom to make it more concrete for this kind of networked structures. Stigmergy. This term borrowed from, interestingly enough, from the research of the communication of state-forming insects, is meant to denote hint-based communication. And this is interesting in itself because the market is stigmergic too. A market economy is stigmergic too. That means hint-based means it signals and controls through prices. In the market, for example, if someone says we badly need this and this, and we give you a lot of money if you do that. Yeah? And then people can compete and say, yeah, well, I do it, this is a good price, I will do it. This is in the sense stigmergic that the price sets a hint. It sets a hint, here's a problem. We are willing to spend money in this because we have the problem, who is interested? So it's hint-based. There's a marker that says, here's a problem. But why has the marker to be a price signal? Yeah, actually, this is an interesting question. This is, in a way, Hayekian. As they say, they use the as I think, very unfortunate notion of commonism. In commonism, too, there will be clues, and thus indirect coordination. But these clues do not communicate the logic of exploitation and exclusion. That's their argument. But the logic of inclusion. For this, the cues cannot be one-dimensional quantitative, but must have a multidimensional qualitative shape. The hints will communicate, for example, where contributors are needed and what the goal of a project is. They will show, no, it's not the bread anymore, they will show a steel coordination commons who needs how much steel. What in markets is done by prices. If I badly need steel, I offer high price for it. I say, if you give me steel, I give you a lot of money. That's the communicational form of the market. Here the idea is that it's in a way directly communicated, and Hayek would now pop up and say, well, I told you, this is a big problem because you cannot compare different levels if they are multidimensional. The point of money is that it is one-dimensional, that it's a strength. Anyway, they signify to a plaster commons where it is needed. They tell all innovation commons that automation of sulfur mining should be developed urgently because it is harmful to health. They allow agricultural commons to plan their production for the next year. And they point to conflicts that need to be deliberately resolved. The coordination effect here is also indirect. One can state, okay, obviously the idea is that it's decentralized, and this is an important condition after the socialist calculation debate. It's decentralized, but the coordination is not supposed to happen via quantitative prices, but what they call rich information. And now you can think about how this process medially evolves. There is a book by Daniel Saros with the name Information Technology and Socialist Construction, which was highly discussed in the several years. He was a little bit ridiculized to be called Amazon communism, because the idea is that you have a central list. They have a central list in which everyone adds what he needs or she needs, and everyone what he or she needs to offer, and this is as a coordination mechanism, so to speak. The idea is how to substitute for the price signals. If you are interested, the book of Serres is actually the most far developed approach in that direction. If you're interested in that, you should read it, although it has its own problems. Of course, this information must also include quantitative aspects. For example, a bread baking commons will, after all, not only tell the flour commons what kind of flour it needs, but also how much of it is needed. Since there should be no abstract unit for everything, the price, also the competition mechanism seems to be cancelled out, because a given flour commons can't offer a flour cheaper than another, since there are no prices. And this leads to a lot of very vexed problems. For example, what if a bread commons produces bread that nobody wants to have, because it's simply bad? In markets, it's easily solved because nobody buys the bread. In a commons organized economy, there is no indicator for that. You can say, well, their bread is crap. But if they want, they still produce over and over. So you have the problem that you cannot select from the market. And I see, this is economy of time. I have to look a little bit into the time. And they argue it's not planned, but it's a self-organizing society. The common mediation does not plan society, but enables people self-planning. And this is, of course, very close. I won't read the quote right now. It takes too much time. This is, of course, very close to Hayek's argument that planning is central to every economy. This is not a dispute about whether planning is to be done or not. It is a dispute as to whether planning is to be done centrally or divided among many individuals. So, as I said, without the mechanism of competition, it is not really clear how you can erase bad products from the market and how you can produce, for example, offers to new desires. And to end up this theoretical discussion here, I just wanted to show you another argument by Mickiewicz. They say, and this is quite an interesting problem, they argue, if you have these commons that get networked, perhaps the necessity shows up for so-called what he called meta-commons or hubs. Hubs are particularly important nodes of the network. You see this is inspired by network theory. In capitalism, companies or state organizations are hubs. In communism, it is the commons that perform meta-tasks. That is, tasks that allow the self-organization of other commons projects. The edges, it's relating to an image in the book, stand for the mediation between the nodes. Because I really love to criticize their book, I have to argue at this point that this leads to new problems, because communist coordination in their sense is not reducible to horizontal networking of collectives via stigmergic signals, but they argue it needs an additional coordinative layer, the meta-commons. But when you think through it, wouldn't that mean that at a certain level of complexity, wouldn't meta-commons to be established to coordinate the meta-commons? And if so, doesn't there result a cascade on top of which something like the central meta-commons emerges? And doesn't that mean that through the back door, central planning comes in again? Stefan would harshly dispute that. Next time I bring him with me and we quarrel all the time in front of you. This is a theoretical problem, but don't forget, one thing is important. We always reject the idea of central planning institutions. But think about climate change. Don't we need a global coordination structure that is possible to coordinate, ideally, all countries on Earth, because otherwise we won't ever solve the problem of climate change. Just a suggestion. Centrality is not per se bad. Sometimes perhaps it's needed. Don't go into the theoretical problems right now, but it might be necessary in one case. So this was just a little, and we had much more complicated discussions, just a little view into our theoretical problems. Yeah, and I have 10 minutes, that's perfect. Economy of time. And now I will just show you also very shortly what we did with the simulation. You don't have to imagine this simulation as a kind of Sim City-like world in which people run around. Actually, we had the idea at the end of our experiments that we one day will program a computer game with a different economy, just for people then to test out how it works for them. Actually, such games already exist, like the Democratic Socialism Simulator. You can find it on the net. But it's one thing to make an abstract ABM simulation and the other to program a computer game. So this is a task for the future. Unfortunately, we haven't got funding for that right now, but who knows? Okay, the simulation, I will skip to this. These are some basic theoretical cornerstones of the project. The agents, for example. This is a very good thing in agent-based simulation. You don't have to accept right-hand, as did many models in neoclassical economics, that the agents are self-optimizing, optimizing their own utility, that information is complete and transparent. You can model agents with bounded rationality. For example, entities that forget after 2 rounds of iteration what they've done at first or something like that. You can give them, in principle, every form you want. The idea is then that the agents then interact and structures emerge. Yeah, it's the same like in cellular automata, for example. Cellular automata are very similar to agent-based modeling, and this is a very well-established area of research that you program such system and structures emerge. And this was, of course, interesting for us. We give agents basically some properties from our models and then let them interact and look what happens. So the rest we can skip that. This is a sketch of the basic structure of the simulation model. We have several types of groups. These are the agents, so to speak, the persons. And we gave them some characteristics. We have, for example, what I personally find very funny. We have an egoism parameter. And you can change in the simulation how egoistic people are and how they try to address their everything to their own needs or not. And so we can fiddle around with make the agents more egoistic or not, and so on. And these, since in the model, the self-addressment of the agents to commons is free, they can associate with different groups. These are, so to speak, the commons. We call them groups here. That's for some theoretical reasons. There's one group that is about producing care means. It was very important for us that care is not outside of the economy, but it's part of this economical structure. Care, we have an environmental sink group, for example. There, that's about basically dealing with the problems of pollution. We have the blue group is for producing the means of production, which was, as you know, as I told you, the central problem point in the argument of Mises against the early ideas on a so-called socialist economy, and so on and so on. And the idea is that they can form together, and we then try to observe how they behave and what happens. And you must imagine this like that the end of the results of the simulation are not people running around and in fancy three-dimensional graphics, but what you get out are such charts that tell us something about how the dynamics of the systems evolve. The predefined experiments are repeated several times and data of each one is collected, which can then be analyzed. Each repetition takes place with a different so-called random seed, which influences the random variables of the model. We started with a random distribution so that we didn't imply our premises into the structure of the agents. This allows the stochastic variance to be represented in the model. It allows an analysis of the processes and assessment of how much the results vary and how robust the model is. And actually, the first thing we try to find out is, can we run this several times without it collapsing? For example, that all agents run to one group and nobody takes care of care, for example. Perhaps this happens. Yeah. But actually, after several, how this is done in simulations, after several reiterations, we could at least build a structure that was stable. And this representation, for example, this represents the so-called agent's well-being factor. The phases show the average well-being of the agents in the different distribution experiments. The transparent colored areas represent the 0.05 and 0.95 percentiles of the data, and so on and so on. This is about, for example, proximity of nodes in the networks. And we could observe that networks form. Actually, they did. We built up, networks emerged, which we have represented in these fancy structures. Here we could see how a networks emerges. And of course, the problem is this network formation not implied in the structure of the model itself? Of course, it is in a way, otherwise it wouldn't be possible. But which form this takes isn't given by us. And I have very big problems. We had very big discussions about the interpretation of these results. Because in a way, I wasn't really sure if that helps us to understand which problems we have to clear up to understand the emerging dynamics. At least, as Manuel argued, it is striking that the experiment called exclusive allocation leads to completely separated productions networks, whereby the network of a culture, the so-called traditionalists in blue, disappears completely. The disappearance of a culture and the stabilization of the reproduction, as well as the well-being of the agents, can be achieved by two institutional mechanisms. And so we then added, layer for layer, new institutional mechanisms to find out at which point the model becomes stabilized. Thus, we can show that the distributional conflicts in the simulated society can be absorbed by two very different institutional mechanisms. They can mitigate short-term crises and strengthen the systems in the long run. The mechanism of what is called indirect reciprocity stabilizes the exclusive allocation setting without introducing new structures, in contrast to the common inventory, where all groups of all cultures would have to agree politically about the new structure. And so on and so on. Basically, the time is up, and I have to say that this shows the difficulties, in my point of view, we had on agreeing how to interpret the model. Basically, what our simulation group found very convincing was that this system could be stabilized and that we could observe a network forming structure. That sounds not much, but it's better than nothing, I would say, for this quite radical experiment. And the least we can say, the interdisciplinary connection has allowed our research groups to build up a fruitful discussion, and we will publish, of course, the results far better than I can represent them now in a book which we are working on, The modeling of the simulation has gained greatly as a result, as the different perspectives have raised questions. And this is, I guess, the most important thing. The building of the model together has raised questions that would not have been asked if we hadn't done it, because we came into a very controversial conflict about the interpretation of these results. And perhaps one day we will make a computer model out of it that can be used as a game, and then we will see what happens. Blah, blah, blah. Thank you very much.
Each of your slides is opening huge discussion in every field of science, humanities, and social sciences. Yeah, but maybe it's time for questions. Yes.
Yeah. How do you define in the project the well-being of the actors?
Well, you can simply say we have a parameter who is called well-being. And it's either 0 or 1 and can take every value between. And if 1 is good and 0 is bad, and of course you can decide how it's defined. And this was, of course, a big topic in our project, how to define this. And we took at first the most minimal solution. Because it's so complicated anyway, and we had so many misunderstandings while building the project, that we just decided that if the care level, the care level, the material level, and the ecological level have reached a certain threshold, this is defined as well-being. That means the agents have a kind of a care structure that works. They have goods that are defined as being enough. Of course, it's purely abstract. And what is very important in the model, that the ecological situation is above a certain level. Below it will be defined as ecological crisis. You must imagine this is highly abstract and super minimalized, because otherwise it could have been done at all. Basically also to the problem of computing time. We also had to use in Vienna the supercomputer cluster. It doesn't look like that, but actually we had to use the supercomputer cluster. Manuel had access to it, and we could borrow some time on it to use it, and we had to radically put it down to get just some very minimal information about, for example, does a network forming process start and how is it distributed? And I have to say, it's not much. It's not much, because it turned out to be far more difficult than we thought. And unfortunately, we have just 1 year left. Let's say this state of the model is, we could say that it's finished, but it's only finished on a very, very abstractive level. And as I said, we are not sure how to interpret the results. And I would say that it would be very good if that's the idea for the book, that we invite certain external experts that are used to such modeling processes. There are many people doing this in heterodox economics and also in sociology. And we try to start a discussion about how these results can be interpreted. This is always the problems you have with simulation. You get structures, you get emergent effects, but it's not always easy to decide what that means. And so this is a part of the project that is still coming, that we try to publish it, also the code on GitHub, so that other people can also run the simulation. And we try to come into, and unfortunately we were running out of time a little bit because it took longer than we expected, then to open it up to a kind of semi-public discussion to find out, to interpret what these results really mean. And I have to be honest, I'm not so sure as our economists are that this is a good result, what we have. They are, but I'm not, to be honest. We're still in this discussion. This is very open at the moment, still.
Yes, I'm not sure whether I understood properly the problem of simulations. Do you distinguish between industries? Can you
Yes.
prepare a simulation concerning milk production, for instance, if we talk about commons and cows?
Yeah, the problem, that's a very, we have this, I go back. We have, for example, where is it? We have, for example, different productive means groups. This is, of course, very rough. But the basic idea is that you have one group that produces products for this group to produce everyday things. It's basically the differentiation between producing the means of production and the means of production producing products. This is a very basic distinction. Of course, it's not further differentiated. In a more developed model, you would have to do that, of course. But this wasn't possible. It's just the basic idea that you have the difference between producing means of production and producing products itself. And this is only the first step. This is only the first step in that direction you mentioned. And of course, a more developed model would need further differentiation. But that's not the way we, that's not the stage we are in right now. But it's a very important question.
Is there any ethic committees like that? How someone would decide what is a bad? Like the bad is the bread was bad, but it doesn't mean that it's bad for everyone because it's just from yesterday I don't like bread from yesterday, or I don't like this kind of bread. So is there any ethic committees or groups like who decide what is bad, what is good?
In this model, we have not the differentiation between good and bad. The example of the bread commons was to point to a theoretical problem you have in commons theory, that you don't have a mechanism easily that helps to end some ways of production and to strengthen some other ways, as is in the market. Because if you produce something nobody buys, you don't have to need an ethical discussion because nobody buys it and you have to close your shop, period. The price signal, so to speak, the result of the price signal shows that your bread is obviously bad. Although you like it, nobody else does. So you don't have this problem in a market allocation. Actually, in a commons allocation, you have that problem. And so you are right, because you don't have the price signal helping you to decide nobody wants my bread, so I have to go there. Hey, nobody wants to buy your bread because it's bad, we don't like it. And then the bread commons says, well, we like it. And what then? And what then? And then you have exactly the problem which is avoided by price signals. And in that sense, you would need a mediation mechanism, an ethical mediation mechanism. And that's, for example, where Stefan would now argue that's exactly the task where meta-commons come in. You have a meta-commons that then helps people to solve conflicts because it cannot solved by price signals. You have to get them to a table and say, well, nobody likes your bread. So what do you think about not wasting flour anymore? What about that? And this is actually the problem. And this is why Stefan would argue that a commons organization is contrary to many models of utopian society. It's not one in which all conflicts are solved and the people are good and everything is happy. On the contrary, it would be in that sense more conflictual. But because you cannot delegate the problem to money. Nowadays we have the situation, for example, well, some people have to, in the hotel where I am, some people have to clean up. Perhaps they don't like to do that, but they have to do because they need the money. You delegate the conflict to money. You just say the people who don't have money have to do it. It's their problem, period. I don't care. This is how it works in market economies. In a commons form, Stefan would argue, it doesn't work like that. You cannot use the force of money to force people to do things they don't like. And obviously, as you know, this is often delegated to migrants, people of color. There are racist implications in the way it works in market economies. This doesn't work because this kind of black boxing the problem in price signals is not possible anymore. And then you have to find other ways to deal with the conflict. Nobody wants, this is the classical, we discussed this millions of times, this is the classical who cleans the toilet problem, which you have in every housing community where people live together and the toilet looks bad and nobody has to clean it. In market economies, you hire, let's say, a person of color or a migrant, you clean the toilet or you don't get money, period. But if you don't have that option, you need other conflict-solving mechanisms. What?
Schedule. Clean by schedule.
For example, a wonderful example of planning. This is planning. You plan it. You can do that. Yes, and this is the, don't have this, always have to apologize for our primitiveness of our model. We don't have this kind of consideration in the model. It was just about the network forming by stigmergy, so to speak. It's very basic, unfortunately. It's very basic, but this is a very interesting problem that pops up all the time when you think, because you have with money, you have a forceful mechanism of reduction of complexity. And that's why Hayek said that it's a good thing. It reduces complexity. But when you take the example of the people that have to clean your toilet, this kind of reduction of complexity can also be read as oppression and racism, for example. And this is a very difficult problem, I have to admit.
So,
Ask me, I'm not biting.
yeah. So changing a little bit subject. Where's media studies here?
Well,
Because you are using infrastructure of simulation, of course. This is media, but if we are talking about theory and how we convert theory into kind of model, yeah? So in this model, media are just an infrastructure to solve the problem. Where is the critical, for example, if you thought about this level, that this kind of structure, media structure or infrastructure, I'm speaking about the whole concept of technology you use here and thinking through technology, is again another layer of producing a kind of you know what I mean, model kind of economy which is based on this and not that technology. Yeah? Do you have this? It's okay. You choose it. You are right to do this. This is a research project. But I'm thinking about where is media study in this, apart from the technology or processes you are using to understand some concepts from economy or philosophy?
Well, in the theoretical discussion, it has a very central place because, as I said, since mid of the 20th century, economy is basically understood as an information process. There's, by the way, a very, very good book by Phil Mirowski and Edward Niccar called The Knowledge We Have Lost in Information. It's a history of information of economics. Super interesting, super interesting. And because at least there are some forerunners, but at least since Hayek, and the following discussions, economy is basically understood as a process of distributing, organizing, storing information. This is basically a media theoretical question. Interestingly enough, Hayek compares the market to information process, to a telephone system, and Oskar Lange later, he was market socialist, Oskar Lange later argument, well, the market is a quite primitive computer. And we have so good supercomputing systems and blah, blah, blah. So on the theoretical level, this is completely clear because the question is, if you don't rely on price signals, which can be seen as a medial process. Money is a kind of medium. This is a very complex medial artifact. It transfers information. it transfers information. It has a so-called value, of course not in its materiality, it's just a sign. It transfers information. And so you have, on this level, you have this is a very clear media theoretical question. What other media could you imagine that play that role of transferring the necessary information without reducing it just to a number, as does money? Is that possible? Saros, for example, his list, the endless list. So here in the model, except from the point you mentioned that to observe how a simulation is constructed is itself, of course, an interesting media theoretical question. How are models transferred into a theory, transferred into a model? Which role plays simulation in science? There is many research on this for natural sciences, but not, for example, for sociology and economics, except from the work that Hanno Pahl has done in his book. For example, here in the model, you have the problem, and this was, I'm sorry to say this again, of my critique of the model, that we don't have a layer of information processing inside this world. So to speak, that would be highly interesting. I made a plaidoyer that we have to introduce, so to speak, synthetic media. The media that are part of the simulation, that are available to the agents, and now it's reduced basically to their memory. The agents can remember processes, they have different skills to communicate, but the communication between the agents is, so to speak, unmediated in the model. And this is exactly what is criticized. And therefore, I said, that's a problem. We cannot introduce the non-mediated communication between the agents in the model when the whole point of the argument is that the informational processes between the agent is the problem we are dealing with. Yes, we understand. I'm waiting for the next iteration, and I will insist on that. But this is actually a problem because it's not, this is, so to speak, done because it's done on a very, okay, the population is actually can be big as wanted, but then you just avoid this informational complexity problem, which is, by the way, the main point of the whole socialist calculation debate. And I would say, okay, I understand this was complicated enough. It's now only about the network forming process. Okay, but to have a more realistic model, I would say we have to argue some kinds of, and I perhaps one day in the future would love to write a paper about this, about simulated media inside such a simulated environment. Because if you know from online role-player games, you can have such media inside the game that are used by characters, for example. And this would, of course, be the next step in complexity, which is, in my point of view, absolutely necessary to understand the model. It's not so easy.
I've got a question about the relation, how to understand locality and situation in this moment, because I suppose that you had to use a lot of input data, so the population is really big, but how small can be population to simulate these models?
Well, actually, you can choose the vastness of the virtual population as you like. But the problem is, if you have very much agents, you have to compute a lot, and the computing time gets expensive. Yeah, that's a basic problem.
I was asking actually.
Yeah, this is basically a problem. It's basically a problem because this is a problem when you have simulation. It gets very complex, and so you have to scale it down. What perhaps comes into conflict with the question of scaling up is so this. And we are not even agreeing about the point if this scaling up and scaling down problem is on the same epistemological level or not. We are not sure if we are one opinion. But I guess it's not basically a problem. You can do basically with two agents. But this is not very significant. Then you have, of course, the fast run. But it's not enough to form a network. Okay, you can have a network of 2, but of course we try to have a middle population, which is on the one hand computable, but which on the other hand produces enough emergent effects to tell whatever the interpretation makes of it. Let's say it that way. But this, of course, doesn't say in a way anything about the situatedness. But you can give the situatedness, you can give agents in a way a kind of situatedness, and this is partly implied in the model if you give them a kind of memory, that they change their, basically such an agent is a list of properties. It's a list of properties. And this list of property can, of course, change depending from the interaction with other agents. This is not a difficult thing, in principle, to implement. And you can interpret this as a kind of locality. When agents are around, so to speak, with a certain type of agents, you can, for example, structure it in a way that they get more similar to each other. And then they have, so to speak, a local knowledge, which is only their knowledge, and no other agents have. In that way, sense, you can, to partial degree, simulate situatedness. And okay, this was a little bit an experimental answer. I'm not sure what the simulation group would say about this suggestion, but we discussed it, and they have actually memory. They have memory. You can give them no memory, but it makes no sense in the model because it's important in some way if somebody aligns itself to a certain group, it changes the property of the agent. The idea is that agents in that way accumulate skills. That they accumulate skills, and then when they cooperate on a certain project for a while, it gets easier for them to cooperate on that project. This is, when you like, it's to model the learning process of the agents. And you can interpret this as a kind of situated knowledge. But this would, by the way, a very interesting theoretical debate, how to model situatedness. It's really an interesting question. Because I wouldn't say it's impossible, but by, let's say, memory through interaction, I guess you could model it, at least partially. And this also touches on another, but then I'm finished, and another question that is how the modeling of such characteristics, how this relates to the notion of tacit knowledge. Because the interesting argument, for example, in Hayek, is that the local knowledge is not only local, it's tacit. That is, it's often not explicit, and in that way it cannot be transmitted somewhere or stored. And that was part of Hayek's argument. That's why you cannot collect the information that is necessary to plan it centrally, because the information is not even graspable for you. Because the people know how to do it without doing it explicitly. And when it's not done explicitly, you cannot, in a way, store it or something. But this is, of course, also part of the debate of if tacit knowledge is really tacit. If it were, how can it be communicated to members of the group, and blah, blah, blah. And so situatedness and tacit knowledge come into conflict with the idea of perhaps come into conflict exposing the properties of agents, because that means to make them explicit. It's an interesting theoretical problem. But basically this shows, I mean, I have understood how complex this is, and that there is no easy way. I know this is a depressing answer, but there is no easy way to deal with the problem of how to organize economies differently. And I think the two notions of information and complexity are the most important cornerstones of this problem. This is what I suspect right now.
I got some funny thought. You said that money is playing perfect role as an information indicator, what's needed, what's not needed. For example, it naturally regulates the market.
That's the argument of Hayek. Yes.
Yeah, so when someone is gathering the money and someone is very rich, so that's like he's wasting the money. Actually, it's wasting this proper role of the money.
Yes.
Yeah?
This is one of the arguments against Hayek, basically. Interestingly, from the Marxist side. The argument is that Hayek imagines a market that doesn't exist. He's speaking about an ideal market where there are no forces deforming the market. Of course, in the Austrian tradition, there's always the bad state, and as is in the neoclassical tradition, the bad state who deforms the market. But even if there were no state, you have exactly these processes of the emergence of monopolies, oligopolies, which can be in Marxian theory, but in Hayekian theory, this simply doesn't exist. They are only on a horizontal plane actors communicating through price signals. And exactly the problem that you describe is not addressed by Hayek. And this is why many people say that this argument, this doesn't count against the information argument, but it shows that there's an important dimension missing. And that a more realist model has to imply these processes of informational, let's say, deformation. And that's why we think that we also need to take recourse to some arguments from Marxian theory, because we prefer the notion, for good reasons, Marxian instead of Marxist. Marxian theory, because there you have the description of such processes other than in the Austrian, let's say in early Austrian school. It's completely right. This is a problem of Hayek's approach. Thank you for the good question. Thank you.